Sarah smirked, rolling her eyes as she tossed her phone onto the coffee table. "You always assume the worst," she scoffed. "Honestly, Daniel, you're overthinking again." Daniel Harper sat across from her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the type to explode in anger or beg for the truth. That wasn't his style. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "Maybe," he said, his voice calm. "Maybe I am." Sarah sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "You do this every time. One little thing and suddenly you've got conspiracy theories in your head." She reached for her phone again, scrolling aimlessly, acting as though the conversation had already ended. Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee, watching her. He knew Sarah too well. Knew the way she dismissed concerns with casual ease. Knew how she could turn any accusation into a reflection of his own supposed insecurities. And he knew something else too. She wasn't nearly as clever as she thought. He had seen the messages. Not just one or two, but an entire conversation thread. A digital roadmap of betrayal. The names, the timestamps, the whispered promises exchanged between Sarah and her so-called friend. Daniel had been meticulous, gathering each piece of evidence with the same precision he used in his work as a systems analyst. A sloppy liar only made things easier. "Look," Sarah continued, setting her phone down again. "I get it. You're the cautious type. You always need proof before you believe anything. But relationships don't work like that. You have to trust me, Daniel." He let her words settle between them. Trust. That was rich, coming from her. "I do trust you," he said finally, offering her the faintest smile. "Which is why I think you should explain everything to me. Right here, right now." Sarah gave a soft, breathy laugh, as if the idea itself was absurd. "Explain what? There's nothing to explain." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "So, if I were to go through your phone right now, there wouldn't be any messages that might contradict that?" Sarah tensed, barely perceptible, but Daniel caught it. The way her fingers tightened around the ceramic mug, the flicker of unease in her eyes, before she quickly masked it. "Daniel," she said, her tone shifting, "this is ridiculous. You can't just demand to go through my phone every time you get paranoid." He nodded slowly, his face betraying no emotion. "You're right. I can't." A beat of silence. Sarah exhaled in relief. She thought she had won. "That's why I won't." Her brows knitted together. "What do you mean?" Daniel stood, stretching, as he glanced at his watch. "I think we should discuss this over dinner. At your parents' place." Sarah blinked. What? "You always tell me they're like a second family to me," he said, his voice light, casual. "And since they value honesty so much, I think it'd be nice for them to hear exactly what's going on. No assumptions, no overthinking, just the truth." Sarah's face drained of color. You can't be serious," she stammered. Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just quiet certainty. "Oh, I am." And with that he walked away, leaving Sarah frozen in place, her mouth slightly open, her grip tightening on her phone as the weight of what was coming settled over her like a storm cloud. Next stop, the family dinner. Dinner at the Bennett's house was exactly as Daniel had expected. Warm lighting, the rich aroma of roasted chicken filling the air, and an unspoken expectation of civility. Sarah's parents, David and Linda, were gracious hosts, the kind of people who prided themselves on family values and honesty. Daniel sat at the long wooden table, listening as Linda chatted about the upcoming holiday plans, her silverware clinking softly against her plate. Across from him, Sarah was trying to act normal, but he could see the nervous energy beneath her polished exterior. She had barely touched her food, her fork idly moving green beans around on her plate. Every so often she glanced at him, her jaw tightening, as if silently pleading with him to drop whatever it was he had planned. He wouldn't. "So, Daniel," David began, cutting into his chicken, "Sarah tells us work has been busy for you lately." Daniel nodded, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "It has been, but I always make time for what's important." David grunted in approval. "That's the way to do it. Priorities, right?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Exactly," Daniel said, his voice even. "Which is why I wanted to talk about something important tonight. Something that involves Sarah." A silence fell over the table, a brief but heavy pause before Linda spoke up. "Oh?" Her expression was warm but curious, her maternal instincts sensing a shift in the air. Daniel leaned back in his chair, took his phone out of his pocket and placed it face up on the table. Sarah stiffened. "Sarah and I had a little discussion earlier," he continued, watching her carefully. "She thinks I tend to overthink things. She says I assume the worst, so I thought, instead of arguing about it, why not let the facts speak for themselves? Sarah's face paled. Daniel, she said softly, almost pleadingly, but he held up a hand. No interruptions, Sarah, you'll get your turn. David's brow furrowed, his fatherly protectiveness kicking in. Son, what's going on here? Daniel picked up his phone and tapped a few buttons. A second later, the large smart TV in the living room, a screen perfectly visible from the dining table, lit up. The first message appeared in large, undeniable text. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Linda's fork slipped from her hand, clattering onto her plate. David's grip on his knife tightened. Sarah sat frozen, her breath hitching. The second message followed immediately after. Hey, suspect something, but don't worry, I'll handle it. The air in the room shifted from warm hospitality to something brittle, something sharp-edged and dangerous. Linda inhaled sharply, her hand covering her mouth. David's eyes darkened, his expression unreadable but heavy with restrained fury. Sarah, Linda whispered, shaking her head slowly. What is this? Sarah opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her fingers twitched on the tablecloth, gripping the fabric like an anchor. Daniel turned to her, his expression impassive, his voice unnervingly calm. Go ahead, Sarah, explain. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. It's not what it looks like. Daniel arched an eyebrow. Really? Because it looks pretty straightforward to me. Should I keep going? There's more. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Stop it. David's voice was ice cold. Sarah, tell me right now, who is this message for? Sarah's lips parted, but she was visibly struggling to come up with a response. Daniel had taken away her usual escape routes. No gaslighting, no redirecting blame, no turning the conversation into an attack on him. This wasn't a private argument she could twist into a misunderstanding. This was her own words, on a massive screen, in front of the last people she wanted to see them. You lied to us, Linda murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. You lied to Daniel, to your family? My God, Sarah, how could you? Sarah exhaled shakily, desperation creeping into her voice. Mom, please. It's complicated. David pushed his chair back with slow deliberation, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his body spoke volumes. Complicated? His voice was deceptively soft, but the weight behind it was crushing. It didn't seem complicated when you sent those messages. Sarah turned to Daniel, eyes wide, voice a broken whisper. Why would you do this to me? Daniel let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Do this to you? You did this to yourself, Sarah. I just made sure you couldn't pretend otherwise. Sarah's breath quickened. This isn't fair, she hissed. You ambushed me. David slammed his palm down on the table, making everyone jump. No, Sarah. What's unfair is that you've been lying to the people who love you. What's unfair is that Daniel had to be the one to expose this, instead of you being honest from the start. Linda's eyes were glassy, a mix of heartbreak and disbelief. All those times we asked you if everything was okay, if you and Daniel were happy, you let us believe this lie? Sarah looked down, her face crumbling, but Daniel knew better than to mistake it for guilt. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she got caught. The weight of silence settled again, but this time it was different. There was no escape, no clever excuse that could undo what had just happened. Daniel let the moment linger before standing up, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with practiced nonchalance. I think I've said everything I need to. He turned to Sarah, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I hope he was worth it. And with that, he picked up his phone, slipped it into his pocket, and walked out the front door, leaving Sarah to deal with the wreckage she had created. The sound of the front door shutting behind Daniel seemed to echo through the house, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Sarah sat motionless at the dining table, her face drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The weight of what had just happened, of what had been exposed, hung thick in the air. David Bennett, her father, was still standing, his knuckles white where his hands pressed against the table. He was a man who had built his life on principles of loyalty and respect, and right now, he looked at his daughter as if he no longer recognized her. You've made a damn fool of this family, he finally said, his voice slow and controlled, but beneath it was something dangerous, something that said he was holding back a storm. Sarah flinched at his tone, her eyes darting toward her mother as if searching for an ally, but Linda Bennett wasn't meeting her gaze. She was staring at the floor, hands clasped together tightly, her shoulders stiff with disappointment. When she finally spoke, Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah, what have you done?" Sarah's lips parted, but no words came. What could she say? That it wasn't as bad as it looked? That there was some reasonable explanation for the messages Daniel had just displayed in front of them? The truth was, she had been caught in the most humiliating way possible, and there was no spinning it this time. David exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he paced the length of the dining room. "All these years," he muttered, half to himself, half to the room, "we raised you to be better than this. We taught you to be honest, to be faithful, to respect the people who love you, and this is what you do?" Sarah bristled, the humiliation boiling inside her, twisting into something defensive. "Dad, please, this is between me and Daniel. It's not your business." David turned on her so fast that she recoiled. "Not my business?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the air. "You sit in my house, at my table, and let your fiancé walk in here and humiliate himself because of your lies? And you have the nerve to tell me it's not my business?" Linda shook her head, finally lifting her gaze to her daughter. "We have spent years welcoming Daniel into this family. We have spent years believing that you loved him, that you were building a future together. And now we find out that the whole time you were lying to him, to us." Sarah's jaw clenched. She could feel the walls closing in, feel the burning shame clawing at her throat. "It's not like that," she whispered, though even she didn't believe it. "Then tell us what it is like, Sarah," David demanded. "Tell us why you thought it was okay to betray him. Tell us why you strung him along while sneaking around with someone else." Sarah pressed her hands against her temples, her head pounding. "I don't know, okay?" Her voice cracked. "I didn't plan for it to happen. It just what?" David's tone was merciless. "Just happened? That's the excuse you're going with?" Linda swallowed hard, her voice softer but no less condemning. "You had every chance to come clean. If you were unhappy with Daniel, if you didn't love him anymore, you could have told him. But instead you let this go on. You made him think everything was fine while you—" Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Sarah's eyes stung. She had never seen her mother like this before. So genuinely hurt, so disappointed. The realization of what she had done was finally settling in, not just in terms of losing Daniel, but in terms of what this meant for her family. "You need to leave," David said, his voice quiet now but firm. Sarah's eyes widened. "What? You heard me," he said. "You're not staying here tonight. I won't have it." Linda hesitated, glancing at her husband. But she didn't object. The truth was, she agreed. This wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Sarah let out a small, breathless laugh of disbelief. "You're kicking me out of my own home?" David folded his arms. "This was never just your home, Sarah. This was a place where we built a family based on trust. And right now, I don't trust you." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she knew there was no fighting this. She had lost. Not just Daniel, but the respect of the two people who had always been on her side. Without another word, she pushed back from the table and stood. As she walked out of the dining room, her mother called after her. "Sarah," Linda said softly. Sarah turned, hope flickering in her expression. Linda's lips trembled. "I don't even know who you are anymore." And with that, Sarah left, her world crumbling around her. Sarah had never felt more alone. She had been sitting in her car for over an hour, parked just down the street from her parents' house, the reality of what had happened pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. Every time she thought about stepping out, about facing what came next, the thought paralyzed her. She checked her phone again, still nothing from Daniel. Some foolish part of her had held on to the hope that he would text, maybe even call, that he would give her a chance to explain herself, to offer an excuse, anything. But Daniel was gone, truly gone. Not just physically, but emotionally. He hadn't stormed out in rage or pleaded for answers. He had simply walked away, shutting the door on her and everything they had built together. That kind of finality terrified her. Her thumb hovered over her screen, over his contact. Should she try calling him? Would he even answer? Before she could decide, another message flashed across her screen, this time from her father. "Don't come back tonight. We'll talk when we're ready." The words hit her like a slap. She had been kicked out of her own home. The sheer absurdity of it almost made her laugh. She was 29 years old, a grown woman, and yet here she was, being told by her parents that she was no longer welcome. And the worst part? She deserved it. For years, she had taken their unconditional love for granted, believing that no matter what she did, they would always be there for her, ready to clean up her messes. But this wasn't a childish mistake or a small misstep they could forgive. She had deceived them, broken their trust, and embarrassed them in a way that couldn't be undone. With a deep breath, Sarah started her car. She had nowhere to go, but she couldn't just sit there all night, stewing in her humiliation. Her first instinct was to drive to the one person who had been at the center of this mess, the man she had risked everything for. But as she pictured herself showing up at his place, the thought made her stomach churn. What was she expecting? That he would greet her with open arms? That he would be thrilled she had finally been caught? That they could ride off into the sunset together now that everything was out in the open? No, she knew deep down that she wasn't special to him. She was a thrill, a distraction, nothing more. And now that she had lost Daniel, lost the stability of her family, she suddenly saw the situation for what it really was. This man wouldn't comfort her. He wouldn't offer her a future. He would see her standing there, disheveled, humiliated, desperate, and he would realize she wasn't worth the risk anymore. Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the empty road ahead. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Without Daniel, without her family, without anyone to blame but herself. Sarah had never felt more alone. She had been sitting in her car for over an hour, parked just down the street from her parents' house. The reality of what had happened pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. Every time she thought about stepping out, about facing what came next, the thought paralyzed her. She checked her phone again, still nothing from Daniel. Some foolish part of her had held onto the hope that he would text, maybe even call, that he would give her a chance to explain herself, to offer an excuse, anything. But Daniel was gone, truly gone. Not just physically, but emotionally. He hadn't stormed out in rage or pleaded for answers. He had simply walked away, shutting the door on her and everything they had built together. That kind of finality terrified her. Her thumb hovered over her screen, over his contact. Should she try calling him? Would he even answer? Before she could decide, another message flashed across her screen, this time from her father. "Don't come back tonight. We'll talk when we're ready." The words hit her like a slap. She had been kicked out of her own home. The sheer absurdity of it almost made her laugh. She was 29 years old, a grown woman, and yet here she was, being told by her parents that she was no longer welcome. And the worst part, she deserved it. For years, she had taken their unconditional love for granted, believing that no matter what she did, they would always be there for her, ready to clean up her messes. But this wasn't a childish mistake or a small misstep they could forgive. She had deceived them, broken their trust, and embarrassed them in a way that couldn't be undone. With a deep breath, Sarah started her car. She had nowhere to go, but she couldn't just sit there all night, stewing in her humiliation. Her first instinct was to drive to the one person who had been at the center of this mess, the man she had risked everything for. But as she pictured herself showing up at his place, the thought made her stomach churn. What was she expecting? That he would greet her with open arms? That he would be thrilled she had finally been caught? That they could ride off into the sunset together now that everything was out in the open? She knew deep down that she wasn't special to him. She was a thrill, a distraction, nothing more. And now that she had lost Daniel, lost the stability of her family, she suddenly saw the situation for what it really was. This man wouldn't comfort her. He wouldn't offer her a future. He would see her standing there, disheveled, humiliated, desperate, and he would realize she wasn't worth the risk anymore. Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the empty road ahead. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Without Daniel, without her family, without anyone to blame but herself.